Welcome to Marking the End Times. I'm Mark Hitchcock, and thanks so much for joining me for this week's video. On today's video, I want to talk about a very important thing that's happening in the United States right now, and that is the widening rift between the U.S. and Israel that's happening. I believe it's going to have dire consequences on our nation's future if it's not turned around. We all know, I think we know, that America is not mentioned in Bible prophecy, and I think that silence is significant. There are a lot of plausible scenarios out there about what could happen to America to reduce us from our superpower stature. But one of the key factors of God's blessing, I think his continued blessing on our country, is our support for Israel. And as that support begins to quickly deteriorate, this could be another contributing factor to America's demise. And what I want to talk about, and we'll get into this a little bit later in the program, but as this rift between the U.S. and Israel is widening and several key events that have happened here recently, could there be a connection between what's happening in the U.S. and its relationship with Israel and that collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Maryland that just took place a few days ago? So I want to talk about that. And before we get into that, we'll go to the subscriber only section here in a bit. And in that, we're going to answer some questions that folks have sent in. And let me mention those real quickly. One is, this is a great question, if they're literally building a wall right now in Israel, then how can it be close to rapture time? I thought Israel had to be at peace with no walls. Another question is, I hold a pre-trib view, but know others who are pre-wrath. They think the restrainer could be Michael or Satan himself. Could you comment on that? And then a final question about the silence in heaven for 30 minutes. In Revelation chapter 8, verse 1. What is the significance of that? Is something significant going to be happening on the earth? So we'll go in a bit to the subscriber only section and answer those questions. But I want to talk, as I said today, about this rift between the U.S. and Israel that's widening and deepening. There's a very open, very public breach right now between the United States and Israel after the U.S. refused to veto a UN Security Council resolution that calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. This was really an unprecedented move by the U.S. But I want to back up a little bit. I want to look at three recent events that are causing this deepening, widening rift between Israel and the United States. The first one was about 2 weeks ago when New York Senator Chuck Schumer gave a speech on the Senate floor. The CNN, in one of their articles in the aftermath of that, said this is a speech that sent shockwaves from Washington to Jerusalem. And what it is, it's an unprecedented call by Senator Schumer for new elections in Israel. And this sparked an uproar. Here's some of what he said. He said the Netanyahu coalition no longer fits the needs of Israel after October 7th. At this critical juncture, I believe a new election is the only way to allow for a healthy and open decision-making process about the future of Israel, at a time when so many Israelis have lost their confidence in the vision and direction of their government. So he's calling for elections, an unprecedented thing on the Senate floor. Now, President Biden, while not totally agreeing with everything he said, called it a good speech. And there's really been a united outcry in Israel for the U.S. to stay out of Israeli elections. Even the man who many believe could replace Netanyahu decried this speech and said the U.S. needs to stay out of Israel's elections. So this was kind of the beginning of this rift. Now, a second event occurred just not long ago in some comments by Vice President Kamala Harris. ABC News has a headline that says, Harris says U.S. has not ruled out consequences if Israel invades Rafah. And in this interview, it says, in a wide-ranging interview with ABC News, Vice President Kamala Harris suggested there'd be consequences for Israel if it moves ahead with a planned invasion of Rafah in its pursuit of Hamas fighters. And the questioner asked Vice President Harris, are you ruling out that there could be consequences from the United States? And she responded, I am ruling out nothing. Now, to me, this is startling because Israel right now is at the threshold of victory over Hamas. They have Hamas finally cornered down in a small area of the Gaza Strip known as Rafah. And the tragedy of this is, to me, and just this is unthinkable, many in the U.S. want Israel to stop just when they finally have victory in their grasp. And this would be a terrible military decision to stop now when they have the opportunity really to either finish off or at least deal a crippling blow to Hamas. Israeli Defense Minister Gallant says only a decisive victory will bring an end to this war. And by really having a ceasefire, all you're going to do is just prolong this war and this conflict longer and longer. Israel needs to go ahead, win this decisive victory, and bring an end to this war, because Israel is fighting for its life. And here we have a vice president who's saying that Israel should back off at this point and not enter Rafah. And if they do, they may have consequences to suffer. Well, the most recent and probably the worst blow to U.S.-Israeli relationships here recently is the U.S. abstention vote in the United Nations. There was a resolution there to call for an immediate ceasefire in the war between Israel and Gaza. Reuters has a headline that says Biden and Netanyahu on a collision course after the Gaza UN vote. So there was this UN resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in the Israel-Gaza war, and the U.S., who has a vote on the UN Security Council that can really veto any resolution, the U.S. abstained. Now, the U.S. didn't vote yes on this, but it abstained. And this article in Reuters says this: relations between President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu sank to a wartime low on Monday, with the U.S. allowing passage of a Gaza ceasefire resolution at the United Nations and drawing a sharp rebuke from the Israeli leader. So again, at this critical time for Israel, when they're trying to defeat an enemy that wants to obliterate them, that doesn't even recognize their right to exist, when all this is happening, the United States is undermining support for Israel and the war efforts. Now, I've said this many times, the United States doesn't have to be a rubber stamp and just have blind support for everything Israel does, to be a supporter of Israel. Certainly, we can have just criticism against policies in the nation of Israel, just like any other nation. But to me, when Israel is right on the cusp of gaining a victory over this terrible enemy that massacred thousands of their people, to be undermining support for Israel at this point is tragic. Prime Minister Netanyahu, in light of all this, scrapped a planned delegation visit from Israel to the U.S. So that's how upset he is about this. Now, this resolution that the U.S. abstained from in the UN is not a binding resolution, but the vote is highly symbolic of these deteriorating relations between the U.S. and Israel. And many that I've read, many experts are saying they're calling this a turning point in U.S.-Israel relations. Now, one more thing to add to this that I think is really interesting is the U.S. vote in the UN, this abstention vote on this immediate ceasefire, occurred on March 25th. Well, all of us know now what happened the next day. The very next day, March 26th, the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore collapsed. And of course, the Francis Scott Key Bridge is named after the author of the Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem. And it's obviously a powerful symbol of our nation. And we've all seen the video by now. I mean, that the morning that I woke up, my wife had already seen this. She said, "Man, you've got to come see this. That's a shocking video." Around 1:30 a.m., a 100-ton cargo ship, a container ship, rammed into one of these pylons or support columns on this bridge, and the central section of that bridge just suddenly collapsed. We've all seen that. Collapsed right down into the Patapsco River. And this stunning collapse of this Francis Scott Key Bridge on Tuesday, this past Tuesday, will have economic impacts, experts are saying, far beyond the city of Baltimore. It's going to have a long-term, far-reaching ripple effect. There's going to be all kinds of time delays. There's going to be added cost, as now trucks are going to have to take much longer routes to get around where this bridge collapsed. The U.S. is bracing for really major supply chain disruptions. Many are calling this, this one of the major arteries, on the East Coast from north to south. Especially what will be affected, they're saying, are automobiles and farming equipment. So it's going to have a real dramatic effect on our country. And I just want to just cause you to stop and think about this for a moment. March 25th is this abstention vote in the UN, really an unprecedented vote by the United States. And at 1:30 in the morning, the next day on March the 26th, the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapses, really sending shockwaves through our country. Now, we can ask the question, is this coincidence or is this providence? Well, there's nothing in the Bible that tells us that directly. So, I can't say 100% that this was, God's action of discipline or judgment on America. But it's difficult not to see some kind of connection here, I think. Jimmy Evans has had a guest on his program often here at endtimes.com, a man named Bill Koenig. Bill's a close friend of mine as well. And he wrote a book years ago called The Eye of the Storm. And he chronicles in that book and highlights dozens of connections between actions in the U.S. against Israel and then disasters, many of them natural disasters in the United States. And of course, he takes this all the way back to Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, where God says, the one who blesses Israel, I will bless. But then it's very emphatic, but the one who curses you, I must curse. And what we see today with the United States in this kind of withering support for Israel could be a kind of a upping of God's judgment and discipline on America. In the midst of all these things we've seen, the speech by Senator Schumer, the comments by Vice President Kamala Harris, the abstention vote in the UN, with all that happening at the same time, there's this continuing call for a two-state solution as well. And, they're calling on Israel to have a two-state solution with a nation next to them that wants all the land from the river to the sea, wants them wiped off the face of the earth, and won't even ever acknowledge their right to even exist as a nation. So one thing we can be sure of in all of this is that America's growing rift with Israel is serious for the United States. It could be, again, part of the scenario that's speeding the demise of America. It could be part of the reason that America is not mentioned in Bible prophecy. There's all kinds of things in America today, our burgeoning debt, our weakening support for Israel, all the people that are coming into our country, we don't know who they are, that could bring all kinds of terror into our nation, even bringing dirty bombs into our country that could devastate our nation. I think ultimately, I've mentioned this before, that I think God's final judgment on America will be the rapture. When the Lord Jesus comes and all the salt and light is extracted out of this country in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. But there are a lot of plausible scenarios, but it could also be all these things kind of happening and converging at the same time, kind of a convergence of these events that will bring America down. But that's why I'm so grateful to know the Lord Jesus, and I know I'm going to be part of that rapture when it occurs. But we need to continue to pray for our nation, pray for our leaders. They'll support Israel, pray for what's happening in Israel. And doing all that as well, we need to be ready for the trumpet sound and the coming of the Lord. Well, let's go now to the subscriber-only section. We'll answer these questions that I mentioned earlier.